join us here. My name is Joe Eckenseer. I'm the director of Imagine what we call the Building Lifecycle Solutions team. And really what that means is I just have the privilege of being able to work with all the folks who do anything with buildings, whether it's those that are working in design, construction, our facilities management team. I get to work with all of them. I've been with the company for just about 20 years now, and as part of that, especially over the last few years, we've been doing a lot with this whole idea of BIM and FM, Building Information Modeling and Facilities Management. And for the last 5 years, we've been putting out a survey to start getting some information back, because myself and some of my counterparts from our facilities team have been talking about this promise of BIM and FM and this idea of data, this kind of the holy grail of the FM world for well over 5 years, and really wanted to get some better feedback for what was going on. How are people actually seeing things as opposed to what we're talking about and trying to promote the idea and where things can benefit each other between these BIM and FM groups. And so as such, what we'll have here in the presentation today is taking a little bit of time to review some of those survey results to start comparing what we had from years past to where it is now. What do some of those different trends mean, and trying to tie that back. In this particular version, I'm backing up for a minute. A few weeks back, we had a presentation that was just an overall overview of just the survey results and some generalized ideas. The purpose of this particular presentation is really to be dedicated to those people that are not on the owner side of this equation, people that are involved with architecture, engineering, and construction, the AEC side of it all. So if you happen to be somebody that's joining this or watching this recording that is from the owner agency or owner's rep or something on that side of the fence, please do understand that this is the perspective that I'm taking as we're talking about this material. Separately, we can certainly have that discussion about, okay, well, what's it mean specifically from the owner's point of view? But we'll focus here on that AEC world as we're looking at it. So the survey that we've done, we try as much as we can to have it consistent, because if you're going to have data and it's going to be something you can analyze and look at and have some meaning from, there has to be some level of consistency with that data. Inevitably, there's little things here and there that start to come in the way, but we're as consistent as we can. We're pulling out and grabbing this survey information and sending it out to similar groups of people, architects, engineers, construction professionals, building owners, delivered online, and coming back and giving us the results. It is going through and saying, hey, here's a series of fill-in-the-blank questions. Here's a series of multiple choice questions, a little bit of information that we can get about you. So if we think about the things of the people that were taking this survey, there's a level of consistency in here. But if we compare 2019, this last version on the left versus the past, there's a little bit of a larger percentage that came in from engineering, if we're looking at that. There's also a little bit of a shrinkage in the facilities management building owner side. There's a group of respondents that we did not get, or people that we were hoping to respond, that we didn't get our invitations out to in time, so that they weren't able to feed into this. I expect that we'll see similar to the 2018 balance once we get to the 2020 version that we'll be, I'm sure, doing next year. But overall, if we're looking at that, aside from the growth in the representative number of engineers and people doing analytics, largely the same, enough for us to be confident in the consistency of the numbers. Had almost 400 different respondents part of this. So from that, if we're looking at the different types of results that were coming back, we're not covering every question through here, and I'm not going to take the same amount of time that we did to cover all of the results like we did on our first overview webcast, but we need to make sure we've got some proper context in here. One of the first questions that we will ask is, how often are owners requiring BIM? One of the things we started reporting on for the sake of these presentations and findings was a little bit more of a stronger look at this whole never side of things. When we're pulling that through, we don't have never back from 2018 and 17 represented here. But the thing that I take out of this is that from an owner's perspective, somewhere over 25% of owners, over a quarter of all owners, are not requiring BIM. Now, that being said, the quantity of often or very often ends up being pretty good. So we're up over 55%, maybe closer to 60%, not quite, but close to. So there's a nice thing that there's an absolute growth in the volume of owners that are doing some level of a BIM requirement. So from an AEC side, one of the initial things that we'll take is, oh, good, they're finally getting the message, or they're continuing to get the message and come on board with this. We've got to flavor those concepts with some of the other data that we've got coming back, though. Just because somebody is requiring it, are they getting what they should out of it? In particular, when we ask those same owners, what are you looking to get out of BIM, generically spoken? Most of the time in North America, if we're talking about BIM, we're talking about Revit, but we try to leave the questions a little bit more open-ended. The happy thing for me here is that there's certainly a high level of consistency in the big two, which is space and assets. Space being the square footage, the room information, department information, things like that. Assets being the things that are in the building, component families if we're talking about it from a Revit standpoint, but the things that they want to track and keep in mind, keep in part of their facilities system. Manufacturer specifications, roughly even. Okay, that makes sense. Point clouds, an interesting dip in that. There was certainly a larger spike of interest a few years back. I'd expect that we'll see that number starting to grow again as other technologies, cheaper technologies. Technology does what it does. Things like high-definition scanners will get smaller and cheaper as time goes on. That's just the nature of technology. So as that trend continues, I expect that the interest in utilizing point clouds may continue to grow and start bouncing back up. We'll see if I'm right, but we'll see. COBE and IFC data on the far right being about roughly even. I'm good with that. The part that I'm also happy about is the idea of manufacturer maintenance schedules being slowly declining over time. And I'm happy with that because in my personal opinion, and I think opinion of a lot of people, is that maintenance schedules don't belong in BIM. It belongs in your facility management software, absolutely. But that's probably not something that we want to have coming from a Revit model. And owners not wanting that from the Revit model as much, it's consistently dropping down, to me is a good thing because we're starting to get a better understanding of what BIM is all about from an owner standpoint. So owners are starting to become a little more savvy. That's something that we can take from this particular set of data. Now, coming to presumably most of the people here today are watching the recording from the design AEC side, architecture, engineering, and construction. The number of firms that are working on BIM projects most of the time, we'll say always, very often, and often, is absolutely growing. So we're almost 70%. So we'll say two-thirds is probably a fair number in 2019. Two-thirds of firms were doing it most of the time. So there's an absolute trend through there. And that's not everybody still. I mean, heck, we're, as Imagine, still having conversations regularly with people that are justifiably still hanging out with AutoCAD because that's right for them in their application of software for their particular business. But it is still continuing to grow within North America. Back to the owner's side, there's some interesting things. So there's an increase in awareness of BIM from an owner side. There's a continuing growth in the use of Revit or BIM from the AEC professional side. And so when we've got that BIM data coming around, what do they use it with? What do the owners consume that data into? And there's a bunch of different keywords for it. We used to have a slide for some of these things, and still can pull it up if anybody ever needs to see it, but it was going through all of the different acronyms related to facility management software. IWMS being an integrated workplace management system. CAFM, Computer-Aided Facilities Management. What's really the difference between them? Well, to an owner, there's going to be some differences. There's going to be some technical differences between them. Starting in 2019, well, how many people are still using Excel? More people are using Excel than an IWMS system, whatever and however you want to determine that. Now, from my perspective, somebody coming from the architecture world, I'll be aware of the differences between an IWMS and a CAFM system. That being said, from an AEC standpoint, the differences between those are negligible to the point where I don't think I really care all that much at all. You've got CMMSs and you've got all sorts of different things. But to me, as I'm looking at this, the big thing that matters tends to be the idea that no matter what people are using, there's a heck of a lot of folks out there that are still using Excel to help manage their buildings. So no matter what level of technical competency or forward-thinking type of owner agency might be out there, at some level, no matter who they are, what they're doing, we can talk at the lowest common denominator, which will be Excel in large place. If we take that and say, well, okay, if a lot of people are using Excel and you take Joe's mindset of IWMS and CAFM and CMMS and all these things are different labels to the same piece of art, what are people really doing? And if we start combining those things, at least to the way my head works, we'll start getting a chart that looks a little bit more like this, where we were asking people how many owners are using a system that they've developed on their own versus Excel versus any vendor solution, whether we're talking Archibus that obviously Imaginet works with. We're working with Maximo. We're working with School Dude. We're working with whatever else is out there, any vendor-supplied solution. The interesting thing as you're looking at it, the vendor solution, you might look at that first and say, well, that's a junk result because we've got almost 120% of people are using a vendor solution. That ends up being skewed a little bit because we've got places where, in this particular case, people had the ability to select multiple items. And that does become important from an AEC perspective if we're looking at owners and trying to understand. One of the questions we might ask is, what software are you using to help manage your facilities so that we can understand how Revit or CAD or whatever might be able to work with your facilities software? Many owners, not all, but many, use more than one. They will use Archibus for space and asset management. They will use Maximo for maintenance and work orders. There are different people out there, different organizations that might use best of breed for different aspects of facility management. You might have people that just use one, but that's where we get to that over 100% is because people have that option to choose more than one. And the way I was slicing the metrics didn't pull out a company name, so we weren't able to. It's all anonymous stuff, so we weren't able to start dividing it out and say, well, how many respondents chose only one or whatever. So that's the reason for that. From an AEC side, again, that becomes important because there might be more than one facility software solution that we have to be thinking about. The idea of IoT, Internet of Things, largely speaking, Internet of Things as it relates to the buildings, it really comes down to say it's a sensor. It's a sensor that says, is anybody in this building? And is that sensor connected wirelessly or wired to some type of database or monitoring system? So if you think about it, if you've got an office where the light switches are motion activated, that is a sensor. In and of itself, it's not an IoT device unless you have that motion sensor that turns on the lights that's also connected back to a facility system. Because if you've got that tied back into a facility system, the facility system can start tracking and saying, well, when were these rooms actually used, and what can we do to optimize the use of space, of energy, of whatever in these rooms based off their actual utilization. Suddenly that motion sensor turns from just a motion sensor that turns on the lights to an actual IoT device. And you can put a sensor on anything that measures just about anything. And that can be very, very useful for owners, whether we're talking about monitoring equipment or monitoring spaces, whatever it has to be. Overall, the interest in continuing and moving forward with IoT and this idea of sensors does continue to grow. Now, where does that have an impact from looking at it on an AEC perspective? Well, if I've got sensors, I need to have some way to anchor that data to a thing that is inside the building, whether that thing happens to be a room or a piece of equipment or whatever. Turn that around and say, we've got BIM. You can do it with CAD to some extent, but it's a lot better with BIM. We can start saying, well, because I have and I can provide a model, these models have unique identifiers for all the things that are inside it. We can link that unique identifier to the data that's coming from the sensor, and all of a sudden that sensor is pulling in data for you that's in 2D or 3D space to understand what's happening in places. So it's the better and more effective utilization of what BIM can be for those owners that are moving toward IoT. So some ways to think about it. The last column, or the note of have IoT in buildings today when it drops off there. If you remember one of the things I said early on, that we've got a little bit of, we had fewer owners responding this year than in past because we missed out on grabbing a segment of owners and getting our survey out to them. So I will attribute that drop off to the survey results, and that's bad on us. We'll fix that. We'll get it better, so we'll have that consistency back as we're going forward. So those are a lot of different types of things that were from fixed responses, multiple choice types of responses. There were also some places where we were asking questions for different people of what, if you have a problem, just fill in the blank, what types of issues are you running into? And one of the things we asked was from the AEC side, from the designer and contractors end, what challenges do you have in trying to work with owners and integrate BIM and FM? What challenges do we see from that AEC end? And we had a whole bunch of different types of responses coming through. The color coding here is random. I'm not trying to highlight any one thing over another. It's just trying to get something so it's a little bit more visually appealing than every piece of text in here being black or dark blue or whatever. But a lot of different concerns. Budget obviously is a concern, or not having software that can do anything with BIM. Inconsistency in data or data standards. The two that tend to really hop out for me, not if my scope is absolutely there, and is it part of what we're contracted to do or not? Yes. But the two that resonate with me personally a little bit more is the idea of the owners don't know what they want. That'll be one. And the other is the idea of protecting intellectual data. The don't know what they want part, it's a lot easier to deal with than the intellectual property issue. But they don't know what they want. If I go back to a story or situation that I ran into, this would have been, maybe 3 years ago now, more or less. Was in a meeting with a building owner, a large owner, and the group that we were meeting with was starting work on a new building. The building had been through all of the design processes, CDs were issued, general contractor was on board and getting ready to break ground, and the GC came back to the owner and said, hey, we're going to have a Revit model by the time we're done here, and we can put any data that you want to in this model. I suspect that there was probably some level of, depending on what we can get this owner to buy off on, then we've got a change order and can increase our fees. Suspicion. I have no evidence to that, but suspicion. But the owner came back to us, to Imagine It, and said, hey, Imagine It, we've got this contractor says they're going to give us a BIM model when we're done, and we can have any data that we want to in this model. What data do we want? So that idea of owners not necessarily knowing what they want is absolutely true. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but it's an opportunity for all of us on the AEC side to have a conversation. And conversations can lead to who knows what different types of things, but let's consult with those owners to help identify what is important. How we'll go about that, again, we'll get to that in a couple minutes here, but that's a key thing. If you don't know what you want, how are you going to get it? We've got to have a proper goal in mind. The idea of protecting intellectual data, it gets quite a bit more sticky, because we do get into that both philosophical and legal question of who owns that data. And I'm not going to be somebody that's going to tell you right now this is what the answer is, in part because, like everybody else, there's going to be some level of legal concern. Well, Joe said, and then get everybody emailing me with whatever. But there's got to be some level of working well with each other and sharing information with each other that is going to be mutually beneficial, that can get beyond the concerns of who owns the data. I will be of the opinion that if we're getting into that discussion of who owns the data, this is my data, this is my model, this is my design, this is my whatever, then we're starting off at a spot of saying, I'm not as willing as Joe would like me to be to share with others when we're playing in the same sandbox. Now, if we turn around and have that same type of thing of, this is my data, how can we get to a spot where it is equitable for me to share it with you? Completely different story. That's a completely different statement, because we're saying, I put my heart and soul into this, and that has value. And how do I gain some compensation for the value that's in here beyond the set of construction documents? That is a completely valid and appropriate way to think about things. When we get to a spot of, this is my IP and I'm not sharing it, that's the piece that I'll personally, Joe Eichenseer, will have an issue with. It's not a corporate stand that we've got as a company. This is a Joe Eichenseer opinion. You're here. I'm the one talking, so you get to hear my voice and what my opinion is. There's a difference between that and how do I get value out of it. Absolutely two completely different stories, but we hear them both. And we also have people that just give things away willy-nilly, and there's no concern at all for it. So there's an entire spectrum in here, and we need to be able to work with all of that. So those are two of the things that tend to jump out to me personally. Now, if we flip that question, and we did, and ask the owners, so from the AEC side, this is what challenges we saw from design and construction. From the owner side, what challenges do they see in trying to integrate BIM data into facilities management? And we came up with a number of different things. Here were the highest or most repeated types of answers. The biggest one for me is don't know where to start. And that goes back to that same thing we had on the previous slide of, I don't know what I want. If you don't know what you want, you don't know where to start. We're kind of lost in no wayfinding to try and figure out what direction do I need to at least try and head into. Cost is always going to be a concern. Generally speaking, though, if we can justify it, there's some way that people will be able to come up with the money for making something happen, generally speaking. But that don't know where to start ties directly back in. Maintaining the data becomes an issue. Making sure it's accurate is an issue. I think personally, the bottom right corner lack of data goes back to perhaps an educational thing. If from an owner side you didn't specify what you wanted, you're not going to get it. Maybe you didn't specify what you wanted because you don't know where to start, and because you didn't know where to start, you didn't ask for anything, so you didn't get it, so there's a lack of data. As soon as you know what you're looking for, there's no reason in this grand world of BIM that we're in that people can't get access to the data that they're looking for in one way or another. Maybe it's not through a Revit model, but certainly if you've spent any time in Revit, if you've spent any time in BIM, there's no lack of data. There's more often perhaps the need to try and find different ways to sift through the data because there's so much of it and get to the things that matter. So there's some good alignment between the issues that owners perceive they have and the issues that the AEC community perceives that owners have, or the way two different directions of looking at the same problem. There's a lot of overlap in here, which, again, I will take as a net positive, good, that there is this synergy between them all. If all of this is what we have for problems in that environment that we've got of BIM, of I don't know what to provide, I don't know how to standardize it, I don't know all these things. Well, if there's this level of confusion, and there's a lot of it, then what are we providing? So we asked, what deliverables do AEC firms provide? And there's, as you would expect, a wide range of things. Suffice it to say, though, number one is still PDF. CAD drawings still outnumber BIM models, Revit files. So taking that into the context of what the owners need, maybe there's some alignment in here, but what do the owners want still tends to say it comes down to the CAD drawings. Part of the reason is that as we are looking at the owner's software capabilities, what software do they have that integrates with data? Pretty much every single one of them will work with AutoCAD DWG files in some form or another. Not every piece of facilities management software out there can work with BIM or work with Revit. So there are going to be many times where we as design professionals might be using Revit, but we have to deliver a CAD file in the end because that's what the owner needs to integrate to their facility system. We'll always, or almost always, deliver a PDF of the documents that we're developing, but it's out there. I was curious to see that hard copies are not as prevalent as they have been, at least in my professional experience in the back. I'm happy to see that. But there's still a whole lot of printing that goes on for these final submittals. But CAD drawings still outweigh Revit models. That's a lot of data. What does that all come down and tell us about what's happening? Well, there's still some level of confusion or a lack of understanding from a few different directions, from the owners understanding BIM, AEC firms understanding facilities management, both sides and the software that each other uses. There's gaps in there. And as we're trying to bridge that gap, to get the value of what we can from BIM for the life cycle of a building, instead of the 1 to 2 to however many months or years it takes to design a building or construct it, let's pay attention to the 50 to 100 years that a building might live after it's been built. What can we do to integrate that data better? And we're coming into issues like this, like I'd mentioned. What really is BIM? What is FM really? And as you're talking to people on either side of this equation, AEC to owner, are we talking to the right people, the people that understand or are striving to understand that? You might be, you might not. It's worth thinking about and worth considering. From the owner side, don't know where to start, don't know what to ask for. I don't know how to leverage it once I get it because I got this Revit model, but my facility software accepts DXF files. There's a gap there. There's a potential problem. Now, are there ways to help bridge that gap and help transmit data in different ways? Absolutely. Revit, you've got that whole export a table to Excel. Everybody deals with Excel. Every facility solution should be able to work with Excel data, at least all of them that I've run through. So there's ways we can get data out of Revit to be utilized in a facility solution. We just need to be able to know those things a little bit better. How can the owner leverage your model in some way? And when we don't have an answer or we're not sure of that answer, the common way to think about that in a business sense is that when there's uncertainty, there's opportunity. And so from a business perspective, if there is that uncertainty, let's get in and talk. Let's talk about these different things so we can help figure out those answers and then during that process, build a better relationship, maybe sweeten the pot a little bit and get a bit of a different or better contract in place. All sorts of things that can come from it, but we've got to identify that confusion and help resolve it. Because in one other way of looking at it, from an AEC perspective, we've seen a picture like this before, and I've talked about this many, many times. But the solution from a BIM perspective is, yes, we've got We've got BIM. We've got a model. We've got a workflow that's central to everything that we do as an AEC firm. Overstating it a little bit, but go with me on this. It's central to that. So in the middle of this, when a building's going through conceptual design, there's BIM data. When it's going through construction, fabrication, there's BIM data. As we're going through and operating and maintaining it, if we've got an office building and we did a little remodel through there's data. And inside that same office building, I might have a room object that has information about who occupies that room. What's the phone extension related to that room? What network drop number is in that room? There's data in here that can be continually updated and working through it all. And we're like, cool. That contractor that I mentioned working with the owner that said, you can put anything in the BIM, what do you want? That's somebody coming from the idea that BIM is central to everything. And it's all that it can be. You can do anything you want to with Revit. It's BIM is the master of all we survey. Trouble is, if we go from the other direction and we're looking at it from that owner's perspective, BIM is a source of data. It's not the only source of data, it's a source of data. If I go back to one of those earlier slides I had where I said I was happy that owners were not expecting to get maintenance schedules from BIM. That number was decreasing. It was still too many in my opinion, but it's decreasing. It's going in the proper direction because that's not something that deserves BIM as a source of information. There's all sorts of great things we can get, but not that. We're talking about that IoT, Internet of Things, and we've got these different sensors that are in a building feeding information back to your facilities, management information database, whatever. That's not BIM sending the data back. That's a sensor in a room. So BIM is one piece of information that is part of the wider set of data that an owner needs to care about. And I work with this with my team. I work with this with AEC firms everywhere that Revit is a central core piece to business within a BIM-oriented AEC firm. It is right there in the middle. It might not be the only software in the middle, but it's right in there. For an owner, it's a thing. And they've got a completely different perspective. And when we're looking and having those discussions and working out these issues and bridging that gap or clearing up the fuzziness, it's not just saying, hey, I'm an architect, engineer, contractor. BIM is all that you need it to be, and it's all that. No, it's a thing, and we need to understand that owner perspective as well. If we're doing that, and we're looking at these BIM processes and technologies and things that have been out there since 30, 40 years, depending on how you consider it all. How do we get past that? How do we start having those conversations to be able to say, you're an owner, you don't know where to start, you don't know, what data is there, or you go to somebody and they say, hey, I've got a Revit model, what data do you want in it? And they say, that's a great idea, what data do I want? There's a quick, easy way to start refining that massive mountain of what could be into something that's digestible. And again, this is nothing new, but it's still very, very valid and true for what we have today. 3 simple questions. Bear it down and say, okay, what data do you need? If you think about things, look at your facility system today. What pieces of data do you track today? Start with that. It's an easy first step. Now, maybe extend it a little bit by saying, well, okay, that's what you track now. If you could, what else would you want to track? And this might not be something where somebody will turn around and say, oh, yeah, here's my list of 10 things. I've been thinking about it all 5 years now. It may take some back and forth and some mulling over and some cogitation together, offsite, wherever. It'll take a little bit of time, perhaps, to come up with these things to gather information from the right people. Maybe somebody in the facilities department talking to their building engineers and saying, hey, what data would be good for you to have that you don't have today? Talking to people that actually work on the building to understand what they need, not just the people that manage it. Once you have that set selection of data points, then we need to say, okay, how are you going to collect it? Gets to be a very a dicey conversation from time to time. I will certainly argue, as will I imagine most people here or listening if you're on the AEC side, that it's probably not the best use of time for an AE firm to do a lot of heavy data entry because a lot of that has the potential, and perhaps you can say a lot of it often gets changed through the construction process. Why plug in all of the detailed information about, object X in a building if you know it's going to be value engineered and changed and somebody else is going to have to re-input all of that data? Let's worry about getting the data structure into place, and then who is going to be the right person to input that data? Is it going to be the owner? Who's it going to be? Need to identify that. If you can't identify who's responsible for collecting that data, it might not be all that important. Similarly, who's going to keep that information up to date? Often we'll go in and talk to owners and say, hey, do you have a set of drawings for your facilities? Absolutely, here they are. Great. Are they current? Absolutely not. Everything's out of date to some degree. Maybe it's in the process of being updated, or maybe it's decades out of date. Who knows where it's at? But there's a constant battle of time to keep the facility running versus maintaining the documentation and the data behind that building. Once again, though, if you cannot find somebody within that owner organization that is willing to commit to keeping the data up to date, keeping it current, that data is probably not very important. In fact, I would say it's going to be counterproductive to have that information inside your facility system, inside your models, inside BIM, because if it's not current, then people won't trust it. And if they don't trust some pieces of data inside your database, are they going to start not trusting anything? So let's make sure we're focusing on that. So depending on where you are, you ask question number 1, get to question number 2, things might filter out of your list. Ask question number 3, more things might filter out of your list. And when you're done, when you get through all of these 3 types of questions, what you're left with at the end becomes really good value, really good information. And maybe this has already been done. You're talking to an owner, and you're talking to one of those owners that has figured it out. These are the pieces of data that we need. And in fact, you're going to be working on a building that was generated by somebody else, and it was one of our first BIM projects, so I've got a model for you. That can be kind of cool, kind of scary at some point as well. I don't know about you all, but there were projects that there was a project that I was working on. It was a healthcare center, and it was a government project, and funding got messed up or something happened. I don't remember the details. This was 25 years ago, maybe more. But either way, the project went and was shelved for about a year and a half. When we came back to it, it was drawings that I had worked on, a project I had worked on, but looking at it at that point in time, I said, you know what, I'm going to redo things. Maybe we changed our CAD standards a little bit between now and then, or there was a person that was working on that with me that I didn't think they did all that great. All sorts of sometimes petty, admittedly, things were going through my mind. And we ended up redoing part of the building, redrawing it, remodeling it from scratch because we wanted to make sure that we refreshed ourselves with the building. That was the way we went about doing it. So when you get that model from an owner, you might get something that looks good. It was our first BIM project. Had a lot of good data in it. Well, you've got to be cautious. And I'm sure you are. I'm sure everybody is, because you never know when something that looks great here ends up being a model that looks like that. Because for what this particular owner needed, we needed area calculations. Cool. I got them all from our room objects. But if I needed equipment, not every piece of equipment was really an object inside Revit. There's an embedded CAD file, an embedded AutoCAD file inside the model. In the end, all the documents went out the way they needed. In the end, the owner got the data they wanted. So I would call it, yes, this was a successful project. I'm okay with that. However, what's the reality of you taking that and moving to the next step? There's going to be things where even though the owner says, yeah, I've got a model, you don't need to come out here to validate the existing space. You know as well as I that that's not anything we can trust. So as we're looking at moving that way towards BIM, keep in mind that it's a great step forward. And as you're talking to the owners, making sure we're communicating this is a great step forward. But there are also going to be places where we must do our professional obligations and validate those existing conditions. And that's, sending somebody out with a tape measure and a camera phone, sending people out and grabbing a high-definition scanner and doing such different types of things there. If you're in that same room where we didn't have everything from a model standpoint, I could probably drop in a scanner, do, in that room, maybe 2 scans. 10 minutes later, I've got all the dots and points I need, so I don't have to worry about remeasuring things back in the office. I can start making comparisons of, here I scanned the building, I'm going to overlay that scan on the Revit model, and how well do they line up? Did the contractors build it close enough to the way the model came out, or are there some big changes here that never made its way back into an existing conditions model? There's a lot of things that we've got through that, keeping in mind that we still got to validate everything that's out there. It's great data, but we need to validate it. When you get that information from the owner, and we get that model from the owner, did you also get their shared parameters file? If no, but you want to be able to reuse the data because it follows the right format, well, you can always just use that existing file and all the data is there with the right shared parameters. But then we've also got tools like there's the Imaginate utilities for Revit, where there's a shared parameter tool which will validate, look through a model, find all the shared parameters, look at your shared parameters file and say, hey, here's all the stuff you're missing. Do you want me to add them to your shared parameters text file? And help populate things so you've got it as a better archive as opposed to just something that's sitting inside a Revit file. Validating, are the shared parameters, do you have 2 different shared parameters that have the same name but are 2 different data types? In one place it's a number field, in another place it's a text field. Looking for those inconsistencies and fixing it so that we can validate what's happening inside those models and move forward with it. We're looking at some screen caps of Navisworks here, but the same type of thing happens for Revit. It's a matter of making sure we've got some of that due diligence from not just the geometric side. Laser scanning or physical measuring or pictures can help fine with that. But we're also talking about it from the internal data structure where things like shared parameters absolutely still become an important thing. And so you've got that owner that's providing you a model, or maybe you're providing a model to that owner. There's going to be those standards that are applied. Hopefully the owner's got some of those. Hopefully. If not, maybe you can help with that too. Maybe that's somewhere Imagining can help fit in the middle and help with that overall communication. Whatever it's got to be, there's places where we've got data on both sides. And as we're doing that, then, if you've got some level of standards that you have or that the owner's providing you, there's data requirements that exist. If you have those, if you have some standards, if you've got things the way it needs to be for the building for the sake of the data behind the scenes, both geometric and non-geometric information, once you have that information, it's really up to us to start sharing and working with that. The owner sharing their requirements with you. You're sharing your understanding, your knowledge, your ability to plan out and work with them through this with them. If you don't have that information, you know what? You still need to share. And I will say the key thing here, and this will be a Joe's opinion thing again, the key word that we're talking about is we're saying, yes, we need to share. I am not saying specifically that you need to give it all away. There's got to be everybody's in business to stay in business to some degree or another, however you want to choose to phrase it. But we've got to be able to share with each other in some sort of a mutually beneficial way. It cannot be just give here or take there. We'll talk about it a couple other places, but we need to work with each other in this. Sharing is different from giving. Sometimes you might share without any exchange of money. You might share with nothing more than a thank you and a handshake, so to speak. But there's got to be this ability for us to be able to work with each other. Some things you might hold to your chest, but other pieces don't deserve to be held close to the chest. Because in the end, when we're sharing data, whether it is sharing a Revit file, sharing a CAD file, sharing IFC information. IFC, think about it as like a DXF file for BIM data. Things sometimes get lost in translation. Geometry might not look the same after you've exported it to IFC, but it's that common neutral file format that theoretically we can share with everybody no matter what platform they're on if it's a BIM-enabled platform. all of the tools exist for us to be able to do that, whether we're sharing through just saying, hey, I want to save out an IFC file, or if you're going to the Autodesk toolkits for the interoperability tools for sending out a better IFC file, for exporting a COBie spreadsheet. If you're not familiar with COBie, it's basically, again, like data. COBie's a subset of IFC, and it's essentially a spreadsheet of information. And the COBie data format is basically a column of information for every possible thing that any owner might potentially ever want for a building, which translates into it's too big. If somebody says, yeah, I just need a COBie deliverable, and that's all you get, you don't have enough information. You need more data to be able to understand better, well, what parts of COBie do you want? What parts of COBie are the data points that you really care about? When we're pulling these things through, you don't want 11,000 pieces of data. I'm pulling that number. I don't really know how many data points there are, but there's a bunch. You don't want them all. It's going to be data overload. Don't do that, but what subset of things do you need? Let's have that discussion. Break it down a little bit so that you, as an AEC firm, are providing both what you're contractually obligated to send out. You're providing what you might be doing as a good faith, as a good business partner, or whatever other reasons you have, but it's a limited set, not this open-ended, give us anything we want and we'll ask you for more when we're done because we don't know what we want and we'll get it wrong the first half dozen times anyway. There's plenty of ways to get people the data they want. Outside of the Autodesk toolset, you've even got things like the Imagine It Clarity software. One of the things we can do with our Clarity software, one of many, is to be able to take the data from a Revit or a collection of Revit files and pull it into a Microsoft SQL database. Once it's in SQL, again, data can go anywhere. It's just a matter of mapping information from one place to another. You're using this as a place where we can say, well, we can go from SQL to a COBie datasheet. We can go from SQL to directly a facility management system. It's a matter of just database mapping, and you're good to go. But we can take that data, unlock it, and pull it into this more open SQL database than the Revit side where you have to get to it through more of an API. If we're taking all of this possibility and trying to break it down into things that matter the most, back on one of those first slides I had of what do owners want to get out of BIM, their first two things that they stated of what they wanted to get, justifiably so, are space, your square footage, and assets. And there's plenty of other things for that. Going back to the Autodesk side, even something like that's a screen cap from an iPhone of the Building Ops software, works with Revit and can extract all sorts of things for a work order management system. You know, you've got a sync with a leak, just a quick way on the phone to be able to say, hey, there's sync with a leak up here, and let somebody go fix it. For those core functions, all we need is what building are you in, what floor are you on, what room are you in. That locates where you are geometrically, geographically within that, within the world, or at least within that owner's catalog of different buildings that they work in. Then once you're there, it's just a matter of data. What data is associated to that room, all the parameters that we've got set up in Revit. For an asset, for a thing that's in the building, think of it in our world as a component family, if you want to call it that. We have just a couple basic things that are needed, like a unique identifier. There's one built into every object in Revit as it is. Every object has a unique identifier, so that's done. And then do you want to get something like maintenance or warranty information in there? Do you want to get manufacturer, model, part number, serial number in there? Everything becomes possible at that part, but at that core function, these are the types of things that people will care about the most. So if you're having any conversation with any owner talking about building floor, room, unique identifier, maintenance schedules, and warranty information, that's to the core of what any owner anywhere needs to work with. And I've said it before, saying it again, it's not always Revit. Revit is a source of information. So the maintenance information, the warranty data, can that be in Revit and transferred into a facility system? Absolutely. Is that the best way to go? Maybe. Maybe not. It's a situational conversation based off of your situation, the construction team, the owner, what data do they have, how can they integrate things. Maybe you just dump all the asset information into a spreadsheet from Revit, and then somebody goes through and starts filling things out on the spreadsheet. Maybe that's the best way to go about it. It can vary, but it's a matter of, as we say in the last point, because everything is possible, we don't want to do everything. It's got to be, a little bit more structured than that, to the things that people will maintain over time. And within that, if it's not always Revit data, maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's because it's not the AEC firms that are filling out that data. If we go through it all, I would say in a project execution plan, either owner defined or defined by one of you or somebody you work with, let's get it through there and say who is responsible for this data. Because we'll hopefully have worked with the owner to identify what they want. I will say that it should be the design firms, architects and engineers. It'll be their responsibility to put the data structure in place if you don't receive it from the owner already, if they don't already have that structure in place. Once that data structure is there, who's filling out the information and when? How much data goes into the models during design and documentation? How much goes in during construction? How much goes in after construction? Who's responsible for it? I'll be of the opinion that data structure by the AEC firms is critical importance. Most of the data entry probably happens either somewhere during commissioning or somewhere during the construction process, probably not a heavy level of data input by the architects and engineers because so much of that is likely to change. Now, situations can change. Is it a design build project? This probably goes out the window. Is it a IPD project? Probably not the same situation. There's all sorts of things that come into and flavor these conversations, but these are the types of things that we have to talk about so we know what we're going to be delivering. Because in the end, BIM doesn't have to be daunting to your owners. There's all these different things, possibilities that we've talked about. Are we going to be measuring things in one direction, in one way, or are we going to go about doing it some other fashion? Just asking those questions and seeing how we're doing things, what we're doing, all sorts of things. But no matter what direction we're going through, we have to be sharing. And remember that when I'm saying this, it is sharing. I'm not saying giving. Maybe there is some giving, but I'm not saying you must give. I'm saying we must share. And there's some back and forth that happens with sharing. It's not a one-way street, because if it's a one-way street, we start to fall into these types of lose-lose or win-lose situations, and somebody comes out of that really grumpy, and it's not a good place to be. If we want to be able to grow business, if we want to be able to make things better as an industry, we've got to strive for that win-win situation, which goes all to that communication, which does go into sharing, which does go into working with each other, which does go into trust each other but verify what we're doing. It's not trust blindly, trust but verify. And then through all that, this was the ideas of what you can do, what types of things we can expect to see, what types of things are leading us to these conclusions based off the data we've got from the surveys we've been doing for 5 years now. And from an Imagine It side, we still exist here as a place to be leveraged by everybody in this AECO environment, whether it's something where we've been called in to help out with a AEC firm that's working with an owner and they want to be able to communicate more clearly with the owner on their level, and that's something we can help out with. There are places where we've been helping out with owners of figuring out what is their data standard, how do things need to go, and what are maybe some baby steps we can go through to start figuring it out little by little, because maybe I can't figure all this out from the beginning. Maybe the whole thing is I just need to get a Revit model, see what can go into it, and then from there back myself up a little bit as an owner and determine what my Revit standard is, what my BIM standard needs to be. So I just need to get something to analyze, because if I can't see it, if I can't touch it, if I can't work with it like a model, I've got to do that before I can determine what I can get out of it that's valuable to me. So what are those baby steps that we've got to go through? How can I make Revit talk with my dad's FM system. What are the possibilities through here? These are places where imagine it exists to work with everybody to try and make sure that we as an industry get to work more efficiently, get to work better with each other, and can communicate better so that we all come back and find ourselves in that win-win environment. So that's a lot of information we had through here. The data supporting it, the conclusions that we had coming out from it, really focused on it from more of an AEC perspective, putting in some of the owner side just to make sure that we understand that there's more than one way of looking at things. But with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. And with the period of time that we have left here, open it up to questions.
Thank you, Joe. Right now, we don't have any questions for the group. There are some very specific questions, and we'll respond to those offline. But if you have any, just put them in the Q&A box right now.
This either means I was really, really effective at communicating, or people are just tuned out or swimming.
Yeah. I don't have anything right now, but thank you all for attending. This will be recorded. If you do have any questions that come on later, just send them our way. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.